King Orcus of Ostrom solemnly vows to take the Princess of Zels as his lifelong wife. He publicly swears before the kingdom to love and cherish her for eternity. The young bride gazes up in awe at the Black Wolf King and his strikingly beautiful eyes. Sealing their union, the imposing king bends down to share the ceremonial vows kiss with the princess. Beneath the surface of this grand ceremony lies a dark web of deceit. Later, an aide questions His Majesty on his honest first impressions of his newly wedded bride. The men gather in private to discuss the tense political implications of this royal union. King Orcus dismisses her meek appearance as a mere act while acknowledging her undeniable beauty. Gallia chimes in that the so-called White Rose of Zels is infamous for acting like a haughty queen in her homeland. Vios sharply reprimands Gallia for his loose tongue by reminding him that the princess is now officially His Majesty's wife. Laughing off the scolding, Gallia reminds Vios that despite ascending the throne, Orcus remains their childhood friend. The three companions solemnly agree they must remain vigilant and closely guard against her potential treachery. Reflecting on the past, they recall how the former king successfully repelled a southeastern attack by the kingdom of Vesha last year. Capitalizing on the king's absence, the neighboring western country of Zels aggressively invaded Ostrom's borders. Entrusted with the royal capital's defense, a young Orcus valiantly led his forces and secured a flawless victory. Tragically, an unforeseen catastrophe struck the triumphant kingdom in the bloody aftermath of the battles. While journeying back home, the beloved father and king suddenly fell gravely ill and passed away. Grieving his father's sudden death, Orcus laments the bitter cost of their hard-fought victories over Zels and Veshu. Vios notes that despite the tragedy, the late king would have been overjoyed to see Lord Orcus finally settle down. Orcus coldly rejects the sentiment and firmly declares that this marriage is nothing more than a calculated act of revenge. Meanwhile, in a flashback, the true Princess Wedia arrogantly scoffs at the very idea of marrying a barbarian king. Months earlier, a harsh slap echoes through the room as Wedia cruelly berates a clumsy servant. The young illegitimate daughter trembles silently under her half-sister's vicious wrath. The terrified girl cowers defensively as Wedia continues to glare with unabashed malice. Bowing her head in deep submission, the girl meekly offers her sincere apologies to Lady Wedia. Furious at the perceived incompetence, Wedia demands that the maid Hannah completely redo the task. Hannah stammers a frightened agreement and scrambles desperately to obey the cruel princess. As the illegitimate daughter turns to leave, Wedia halts her with a chilling command. The arrogant princess menacingly asks who gave the miserable girl permission to leave her royal presence. Wedia sadistically orders her to polish jewelry and fix dress embroidery before denying her food until every task is finished. She ruthlessly reminds the trembling girl that her presence in the palace is mere pity for being their father's mistake with a lowly maid. Crushed by the cruel words, the illegitimate daughter weakly accepts her agonizing punishment. Left entirely alone in the massive room, she quietly sets to work meticulously mending the ruined embroidery. Her delicate fingers carefully work the sharp needle to ensure every stitch perfectly aligns. Her stomach growls in painful protest as a reminder that she has only eaten a meager bowl of barley porridge all day. A sudden sharp knock at the heavy wooden door violently interrupts her silent suffering. Startled by the unexpected sound, she freezes in pure terror and drops her sewing. Madame Barnett abruptly bursts into the room and glares down at the exhausted girl with intense disdain. The cruel older woman viciously accuses the girl of possessing her mother's light fingers simply for touching Lady Wedia's belongings. Caught completely off guard by the baseless accusation, the young girl lets out a helpless gasp. A haughty servant blatantly mocks Lady Edel while aggressively questioning her actions. The cruel palace staff openly complain about the king's orders to treat such a pathetic girl as royalty. Edel shrinks back defensively as the palpable hostility of the royal court rapidly closes in around her. A vicious noblewoman fiercely slaps her hand away and demands the filthy girl stop touching her sister's belongings. A sharp impact violently echoes through the room as Edel is suddenly shoved backward. Trembling in sheer terror, Edel stammers out a desperate apology to her ruthless tormentors. The oppressive atmosphere heavily weighs down on the young princess as she cowers helplessly on the floor. Edel lets out a painful gasp as she absorbs yet another cruel and sudden strike. Her abuser viciously berates her for failing to understand simple commands about knowing her lowly place. The battered girl tightly clutches her stinging wounds as her tormentors loom threateningly over her fragile frame. Tears quickly prick Edel's eyes while she desperately tries to shield herself from further physical abuse. A sharp cry of agonizing pain escapes her trembling lips as the merciless bullying finally reaches its peak. The cruel instigator sadistically laughs while declaring that Edel must now feel the queen's true suffering. The scene sharply transitions to Sir Ewan receiving an urgent report about the horrific palace situation. Wasting absolutely no time, the loyal knight quickly rushes through the stone corridors to locate the abused princess. Sir Ewan kneels anxiously beside Edel and softly asks if she is all right. Blushing with deep embarrassment, Edel sincerely apologizes for letting the noble knight witness such a shameful spectacle. Ewan immediately interjects that he is the one who should desperately apologize for failing to visibly protect her. Noticing her fresh wounds, the horrified knight urgently demands that her terrible injuries be treated at once. Edel looks up at her unexpected savior with wide eyes fully brimming with immense gratitude. She softly confesses that his genuine care as her brother's knight acts as her absolute salvation in this dark place. Sir Ewan gazes back at Princess Edel with deep sympathy and an unspoken devotion. Reflecting on her dark past, Edel silently remembers enduring severe starvation and isolation after being cruelly torn away from her mother. Her tragic memories vividly recall how crying for her mother only ever resulted in harsh slaps and severely reduced meals. Edel hardens her internal resolve by reminding herself that acting like an emotionless stone remains the only way to survive their wrath. She tragically accepts that silent endurance represents the absolute only survival method she has ever learned. Gently interrupting her dark thoughts, Sir Ewan discreetly offers her a small package meant for emergencies. Surprised by the entirely unexpected gesture, Edel graciously thanks the kind knight for his incredibly thoughtful gift. She carefully grasps the small bundle while feeling a rare and bright glimmer of genuine hope. A loud rumble suddenly erupts from Edel's empty stomach to instantly shatter the quiet moment. Sir Ewan bursts into warm laughter and happily expresses his pure joy at seeing her finally look so happy. The knight reveals he secretly snagged food from her sister's extravagant tea party because he knew she skipped lunch again. He gently calls out to Princess Edel with an earnest and totally unwavering gaze. Ewan sincerely promises that he is always thinking of Her Highness and deeply begs her to remember that undeniable fact. Edel clutches the precious stolen food tightly to her chest as overwhelming emotion completely washes over her. A faint but truly genuine smile finally graces her thoroughly battered face. The cold palace corridors grow quietly peaceful as Edel discovers a fleeting moment of pure sanctuary. She slowly unwraps the delicate pastries with trembling fingers and eager anticipation for the rare meal. Taking a deeply hesitant bite, the overwhelming sweetness provides a profoundly comforting contrast to her bitter life. Elsewhere, her legitimate siblings happily greet their parents for a lavish family dinner that Edel is strictly barred from ever attending. Edel finally enjoys a proper and delicious meal after enduring severe starvation for so long. Elsewhere, the haughty Wedia complains about the knights annoyingly calling her the White Rose of Zels. Wedia warmly greets her brother as he approaches her with a mocking scoff. The crown prince heavily mocks the rumors of the haughty White Rose surrounding herself with flattering handsome men. He teasingly adds that he cannot blame her since she clearly favors the highly skilled and handsome knight Ewan. Wedia listens attentively as the playful banter between the royal siblings quickly begins to shift tone. A sudden tense silence fills the grand room as the crown prince prepares to deliver serious news. The prince stares down at his sister with a completely unreadable and serious expression. Wedia gazes back at him with growing confusion and a rising sense of intense dread. The crown prince abruptly shatters the silence by announcing that Wedia's marriage has been officially decided. Caught completely off guard by the sudden news, Wedia lets out a bewildered gasp. She stares in sheer disbelief while desperately trying to process the shocking revelation. Panicking wildly, the frantic princess demands to know exactly who she is being forced to marry. Her brother coldly reveals that she is betrothed to the fearsome Black Wolf King of Ostrom. Wedia freezes completely as the horrifying reality of the political arrangement fully sinks in. Furious at the match, she passionately screams about refusing to marry a barbaric king with no culture or etiquette. Her father sternly interrupts the outburst and commands her to direct her complaints to the crown prince instead. He harshly explains that Ostrom specifically demanded the White Rose of Zels as compensation for the prince's disastrous military defeat. Wedia turns to her brother in absolute horror upon learning about his colossal blunder. She furiously blames her brother for losing the war and selfishly destroying her perfect life. The humiliated crown prince groans quietly under the crushing weight of his monumental failure. Their distressed mother suddenly interjects and cries out to her husband for mercy. She frantically argues that handing her precious Wedia over to a lowly nomadic tribesman is simply unacceptable. The father brutally shuts down the protests by declaring that the king has already finalized the absolute decision. Wedia seethes in silent fury over being traded away to an enemy without a single consultation. Refusing any further debate, the strict father coldly declares the entire conversation completely over. A wicked and desperate idea suddenly flashes across Wedia's frantic mind. She excitedly proposes the devious plan of sending her illegitimate sister Edel to Ostrom in her place. Her parents look up in sudden surprise at the incredibly bold and cunning suggestion. Wedia eagerly rationalizes that Edel perfectly fits the vague political demand for the White Rose of Zels. She desperately begs her father to accept this brilliant loophole to save her royal future. The imposing father silently contemplates the dark political implications of the sudden bridal switch. A heavy tension fills the air as the family anxiously awaits his final ruling on the matter. He ultimately agrees that sending the illegitimate Edel perfectly satisfies the requirement of marrying Azel's daughter to Ostrom. Later, a stunned Edel slowly realizes she might actually be sent to the neighboring country instead of her sister. A sudden wave of realization hits her that this terrifying marriage means she can finally escape the abusive palace. She rationally determines that living as a political hostage is vastly superior to enduring endless torture at home. Overwhelmed with newfound hope, Edel rejoices at the beautiful prospect of achieving true freedom. Meanwhile, an enraged Wedia violently yells at her servants for packing her precious fabrics into Edel's bridal trousseau. A stressed maid patiently explains that they must properly equip Edel to uphold the nation's dignity during the royal wedding. The queen furiously sneers at the sheer insolence of a mere concubine's daughter. She glares menacingly as the intense royal hostility fills the grand room. Wedia loudly protests that she absolutely refuses to waste precious dresses and jewels on a low-culture country like Ostrom. Her mother gently approaches the distressed princess to offer comfort. The spoiled princess sulks bitterly over the sudden disruption of her royal life. Wedia dramatically cries out to her mother in a desperate plea for attention. She childishly whines that the illegitimate girl cruelly stole the precious fabric meant for her royal dress. The queen calmly promises to order new fabric while celebrating Wedia's narrow escape from being ravaged by the savage Black Wolf King. Demanding total privacy for her sinister motives, the queen strictly orders everyone to leave the room so she can speak with Edel alone. Edel watches nervously as the loyal servants quickly file out of the chamber. The heavy wooden door slams shut with a terrifying finality. Now completely isolated, the queen slowly turns her piercing gaze toward the trembling girl. An oppressive silence suffocates the room as the queen stares down her hated stepdaughter. She mockingly taunts Edel about becoming a queen even if it is only to a barbaric foreign king. The queen coldly confesses the absolute depths of her true and burning hatred for the young girl. Edel gasps in sheer terror as the venomous words strike her fragile heart. Seething with pure malice, the queen bitterly laments her immense frustration at being unable to kill Edel with her own hands. The battered princess recoils defensively from the overwhelming aura of murderous intent. The queen spitefully reveals that Edel was born a mere 3 months after she gave birth to Wedia. She fiercely recounts how the treacherous king laid his hands on a lowly maid while she was heavily pregnant. The king abandoned his newborn daughter Wedia to shamelessly visit the secluded detached palace. The queen furiously demands to know if Edel can truly comprehend the agonizing humiliation she endured. Edel shrinks away as the terrifying weight of the queen's dark past crashes down upon her. The terrified girl shockingly realizes that her very existence provoked genuine murderous rage within the royal family. Edel desperately hardens her resolve to endure this final torture so she can escape to Ostrom. The queen sinisterly announces that she has prepared a highly useful wedding gift for Edel to take to Ostrom. She calls out to the hallway with a sickeningly sweet tone. Edel gasps in absolute horror as her worst nightmare suddenly materializes. Madame Barnett steps into the room as the queen's inescapable and vicious scheme fully unfolds. Time violently shifts forward as the deeply oppressed princess finally arrives in the enemy nation as a desperate substitute bride. Edel stands at the grand altar entirely overshadowed by the towering presence of the Black Wolf King. The observing crowd loudly murmurs that her striking silver hair perfectly matches the legendary rumors of the White Rose of Zels. Onlookers openly marvel at her ethereal fairy-like beauty and her captivating crystal-purple eyes. The young bride stands frozen in her lavish wedding dress while anxiously enduring the heavy scrutiny. Cruel whispers quickly circulate, doubting that such a frail and scrawny body could ever satisfy Lord Orcius. Edel obediently keeps her head bowed to hide her profound anxiety from the judgmental foreign court. King Orcius suddenly shifts his imposing gaze directly onto his trembling new wife. The startled princess flinches slightly under his intensely penetrating stare. Orcius slowly reaches out as the incredibly tense wedding ceremony reaches its absolute climax. The ill-fated couple stands perfectly still as their dark political union is permanently sealed before the entire kingdom. A tense silence fills the dining hall as the young bride sits nervously at the royal table. The lavish wedding banquet continues while the newly wedded couple shares an awkward quiet. An attendant gently asks the trembling bride if the food of Ostrom does not suit her refined taste. Madame Barnett quickly interjects with a fake smile to claim Her Highness prefers a modest life without meat. The cruel woman arrogantly declares she will strictly manage the bride's meager diet of porridge and bread. King Orcius sharply interrupts Lady Barnett and commands her to address the girl respectfully as Her Highness the Queen Consort. Madame Barnett flinches in sheer shock at the terrifying authority of the Black Wolf King. Orcius coldly dismisses her homeland's customs and insists his new wife will eat properly from now on. The imposing king issues a dark warning for Barnett to carefully consider the consequences of her actions. A heavy and oppressive tension immediately suffocates the massive royal dining hall. Madame Barnett sneers bitterly to herself over the perceived insolence of the barbarian king. Edel watches the intense exchange in complete silence while nervously clutching her dress. A servant politely instructs the bride to change clothes before escorting her to the king's private chambers. Edel sighs in quiet misery as she realizes her anxiety prevented her from eating a single bite. The heavy wooden doors click open as she prepares to face the terrifying wedding night. Madame Barnett cruelly mocks the pale bride by taunting her obvious nervousness. Edel stares blankly ahead while dreading the horrifying ordeal that is about to come. Barnett viciously reminds the girl of her filthy maid lineage and orders her to shamelessly please the barbarian king. The young substitute bride nervously braces herself to endure the wedding night in her sister's place. She slowly walks down the dark stone corridors toward the massive royal bedchamber. The terrified girl silently reflects that the malicious Barnett is the only person here who knows her true identity. She gasps sharply in fear as she finally enters the imposing private quarters. King Orcius coldly asks if he is truly so detestable that she must look so absolutely miserable. Startled by his sudden voice, Edel nervously calls out to Lord Orcius. He scoffs lightly and sarcastically praises her for at least having the courage to not run away. The king bluntly remarks that the arrogant people of Zels openly mock his country as a land of barbarians. He steps closer while stating that it is completely natural for her to despise him. Orcius slowly closes the distance between them with a deeply intimidating and powerful aura. He forcefully reminds the trembling girl that from this day forward she is officially his wife. The Black Wolf King strictly warns her that any treacherous acts will result in immediate execution. Edel shrinks back in pure terror at the deadly seriousness of his royal threat. A thick and suffocating silence rapidly overtakes the dimly lit royal bedchamber. The massive king suddenly reaches out his muscular arms toward his terrified new bride. Caught completely off guard, Edel lets out a highly confused and breathy gasp. She cries out in absolute shock as Orcius suddenly sweeps her right off her feet. He effortlessly carries his lightweight bride across the room toward the massive bed. Orcius gently lays her down onto the soft sheets while looming darkly over her fragile frame. The intimidating king gazes down intently and softly notes that she is deeply afraid of him. Edel desperately stammers out a weak denial while trembling violently under his intense stare. Blushing furiously, she meekly confesses that she is simply afraid because it is her very first time. Stuttering nervously in the grand bedchamber, Edel struggles to find the correct words to address the highly imposing king. The massive physical difference between the fragile bride and the towering monarch creates an incredibly heavy tension in the quiet room. Gathering her fragmented courage, Edel timidly calls out to His Majesty while visibly trembling under his intensely penetrating gaze. The formidable Black Wolf King slowly shifts his imposing posture to silently regard his surprisingly meek new wife. Caught entirely off guard, Edel lets out a breathy gasp as Orcius suddenly initiates their deeply intimate wedding night. To her absolute shock, Edel quickly realizes that his gentle demeanor in private is completely different from his terrifying public persona. From the very first moment he reaches out, his touch remains astonishingly tender and far from the barbaric cruelty she genuinely expected. Overwhelmed by his entirely unexpected gentleness, Edel suddenly realizes with deep relief that she is absolutely no longer afraid of him. The quiet intimacy of the royal bedchamber completely replaces the suffocating dread that had violently plagued the young substitute bride all night. Orcus carefully navigates their wedding night while silently observing the deeply fragile girl lying vulnerably beneath him. The dark shadows of the grand royal room provide a deeply secluded sanctuary for the newlywed couple to permanently finalize their political union. Pulling back slightly, Orcus expresses genuine shock that his supposedly haughty and arrogant bride did not resist his physical touch at all. Edel stares up at the intimidating king with incredibly wide eyes as a silent and profound understanding begins to slowly form between them. Noticing her profound exhaustion, Orcus gently commands her to rest a little longer because her pale complexion still looks deeply unwell. The exhausted princess quietly settles into the luxurious royal sheets while desperately trying to fully process the completely unexpected turn of events. Orcus firmly watches over her resting form with a highly complex expression that betrays his rapidly growing curiosity about her true identity. Demanding that she properly nourish herself, the king strictly insists he will forcefully have a hearty breakfast brought directly to their private chambers. Edel silently watches him take absolute charge of her well-being with a profoundly stunned silence that completely paralyzes her fragile thoughts. A faint flush warmly graces her pale cheeks as Edel quietly realizes that the supposedly savage Black Wolf King is actually incredibly kind. The following morning, Madame Barnett suddenly invades the room and maliciously asks if Lady Wedia slept well during her horrifying royal ordeal. Edel visibly tenses at the extremely dangerous verbal reminder of her completely fake identity while facing the cruel Zell's chaperone. Barnett carefully scrutinizes the massive bedchamber for any obvious signs of weakness she can desperately exploit against the helpless illegitimate princess. Remaining completely silent, Edel cautiously guards her heavily battered emotions behind an entirely expressionless mask to safely survive the cruel interrogation. Elsewhere, King Orcus quietly ponders whether this deeply fragile and profoundly submissive girl is truly the notoriously proud princess of Zels. Pacing the grand stone halls, the king openly admits to himself that his brand new wife is absolutely nothing like the arrogant woman he fully expected. Servios suddenly interrupts the powerful king's deep thoughts by urgently calling out to Lord Orcus from far down the royal corridor. Turning his highly imposing gaze toward his deeply loyal childhood friend, Orcus calmly acknowledges Vios's entirely abrupt arrival. Bowing respectfully, the serious knight solemnly declares that there is an incredibly urgent matter he must immediately report to His Majesty. Meanwhile, Edel finds herself suddenly violently submerged into a terrifying waking nightmare filled with the deeply traumatic abuse from her incredibly dark past. Vicious phantom voices cruelly mock her as the filthy daughter of a whore while disgustingly sneering at how quickly she shamelessly seduced a man. The heavily malicious hallucinations violently accuse the filthy mother and daughter duo of being absolutely disgusting women permanently stained with deep sin. Echoing the darkest political rumors of the Zell's court, the vile phantom voices shamefully scream that she viciously stole the true queen's royal husband. Trembling violently under the immense psychological weight of the phantom abuse, Edel desperately wraps her fragile arms around herself because she feels so incredibly cold. Her fragile heart begins to completely freeze over as the horrifying emotional guilt of seemingly stealing a royal husband painfully consumes her entire being. Desperately reverting to her only childhood survival mechanism, Edel furiously tells herself it is perfectly okay as long as she turns her bleeding heart entirely to stone. She continuously mutters that absolutely everything is perfectly okay in a frantic psychological attempt to firmly anchor her rapidly shattering mind. A sudden and profoundly warm memory of a gentle voice warmly wishing Edel a peaceful good night briefly pierces through the suffocating darkness of her immense trauma. The young princess slowly violently snaps back to harsh physical reality while desperately trying to physically shake off the lingering phantom whispers. Shivering deeply in the massive cold castle, Edel rationally decides she must quickly return to her private room just to properly warm her freezing body. Stepping quietly into the darkened chamber, she is completely startled by a highly mysterious figure who abruptly declares that she is inexcusably late. Startled by his unexpected arrival, Edel desperately stammers out a shocked inquiry as King Orcus suddenly appears before her. The imposing king calmly mentions hearing rumors that his fragile new bride completely skipped the lavish breakfast prepared for her. Trembling with deep anxiety, Edel frantically apologizes while silently cursing the malicious Lady Barnett for forcefully dragging her away. A heavy silence blankets the grand stone chamber as the formidable Black Wolf King intently studies his visibly distressed wife. Noticing her violent shivering, Orcus sharply questions what is wrong while expressing genuine concern for her freezing state. He gently warns the terrified princess that keeping her silver hair soaking wet will undoubtedly cause a severe cold. The massive monarch silently steps closer to his deeply anxious bride while projecting a surprisingly warm and protective aura. Grabbing a soft towel, Orcus begins to tenderly dry her damp hair with unexpectedly gentle and methodical pats. The powerful king softly commands his substitute bride to come closer while referring to her by the false name Wedia. Edel cautiously closes the distance while thoroughly overwhelmed by his intimately tender care in the quiet bedchamber. He gently brushes against her fragile form with a delicate touch that completely contrasts his fearsome barbaric reputation. Orcus bluntly insists that she desperately needs to gain some healthy weight, to which Edel meekly murmurs her utter compliance. He intensely observes her frail frame while firmly stating that she currently looks as if she could shatter incredibly easily. Edel shyly contemplates his blunt words while anxiously wondering if the fearsome king naturally prefers much fuller women. Gathering her fragmented courage, she timidly asks if His Majesty specifically desires a more curvaceous royal partner. Orcus quickly corrects her profound misunderstanding by firmly clarifying that her physical shape is absolutely not what he meant. Blushing furiously, Edel stammers out a frantic apology, but the king simply lets out a deeply amused scoff. A surprisingly soft and genuinely warm expression completely overtakes the notoriously ruthless king's hardened face. Gazing up in absolute awe, Edel silently marvels at the breathtaking sight of the fearsome Black Wolf King actually laughing. Commanding her complete presence, Orcus strictly orders her to share dinner with him, leaving Edel utterly breathless and deeply stunned. The intimate moment profoundly shifts the heavy dynamic between the captive bride and her incredibly imposing new husband. Later in the royal dining hall, a beautiful feast is meticulously arranged for the physically exhausted and entirely starving princess. The malicious Lady Barnett suddenly intervenes and cruelly declares that allowing the princess to eat simply will not do. Barnett sadistically steps forward to violently rip the desperately needed sustenance right out of the fragile girl's reaching hands. The cruel chaperone aggressively reasons that since Edel heavily feasted at yesterday's wedding banquet, she absolutely requires no meals today. A brave servant nervously attempts to interject by frantically reminding the domineering woman about His Majesty's strict royal orders. Barnett furiously snaps at the lowly servant while aggressively demanding to know if they have a severe problem with her absolute authority. Exercising her toxic power, the cruel chaperone forcefully orders the palace staff to immediately remove the lavish food from the table. She arrogantly sneers that such highly rustic Ostrom cuisine is completely unpalatable and entirely unfit for Her Highness to consume. The desperate servant nervously glances at the starving princess while stammering that she has eaten absolutely nothing since early morning. Resigning to her dark fate, Edel quietly tells the servants to take it away so they can safely avoid Barnett's vicious scolding. King Orcus suddenly shatters the tense atmosphere by fiercely declaring that this cruel starvation was entirely Lady Barnett's doing. Caught completely off guard by his terrifying arrival, Barnett fakes absolute innocence and sweetly asks what business brings His Majesty here. The furious king menacingly states he simply wishes to know why his wife's precious meals are being constantly and maliciously removed. Barnett stubbornly lies that Wedia finds the food unpalatable and stubbornly reiterates her absolute right to personally manage the royal diet. Staring down the wicked chaperone with absolute lethal intent, Orcus coldly decrees that speaking with her is entirely pointless. Completely ignoring the panicked woman, Orcus forcefully commands his loyal guards to immediately bring his wife Wedia to him. Barnett hysterically screams that ignoring her explicit authority is equivalent to massively insulting the entire noble nation of Zels. The fearsome Black Wolf King fiercely forbids Barnett from ever being alone with his wife again while brutally reminding her this is Ostrom. Trembling in absolute terror, Edel gasps quietly as her powerful new husband violently dismantles her abuser's inescapable and suffocating control. Slowly blinking her eyes open, Wedia finds herself resting quietly in an unfamiliar bed. Blurry visions begin to clear as the disoriented girl struggles to fully wake up. Gasping in sudden shock, she jolts up after realizing she is no longer in her own quarters. Panic sets in as she immediately recognizes the grand, imposing surroundings of His Majesty's personal chambers. Trembling slightly, she processes the overwhelming reality of being tucked into the king's bed. A commanding voice suddenly breaks the silence, coldly stating that collapsing is the natural consequence of starvation. Looming over her with a stern expression, the imposing King Edel stares her down. Overwhelmed with crippling guilt, the fragile girl frantically stammers out a desperate apology to His Majesty. Cutting through her rising panic, the monarch firmly calls out Widia's name. Presenting a lavish, steaming meal, he issues an absolute royal order for her to eat. Asserting his absolute dominance, he declares that in this country, the treacherous names of Barnet and Zels mean absolutely nothing compared to his highest authority. With an unwavering gaze, he delivers a final, unyielding command for her to consume the food. A warm, perfectly prepared dish sits temptingly before the starving girl. Hesitantly parting her lips, Widia takes a small, delicate bite of the offered meal. Slowly chewing the food, she savors the rich flavors bursting across her palate. Tears well in her eyes as she finds both the hearty meal and the king's surprisingly gentle command to be incredibly delicious. Watching her eat with quiet satisfaction, Edel softly acknowledges her obedience. Basking in the unexpected warmth, Widia wonders if she has finally found a sanctuary where she can feel truly safe. Comforted by a full stomach and a lighter heart, she peacefully drifts back into a deep slumber. The king silently watches over her resting form, guarding her peacefully in the quiet room. Elsewhere, a tormented man thrashes violently in his sleep while desperately calling out for his mother. Jolting awake in a cold sweat, he gasps for air in the shadows of a dimly lit room. Gripping his head in frustration, he furiously curses his miserable, failing circumstances. Boiling with unhinged rage, he violently blames the accursed royal family of Zels for all his current suffering. Resolved to complete his sinister mission, he plots to steal the treasures and return to Zels under Her Highness Iswia's strict orders. Infuriated by a barbarian brat and severed communications, he curses the little girl who finally abandoned Zels. Trapped in a desperate corner, the panicked agent frantically calculates his next lethal move. Suffocating silence fills the dark room as he broods over his collapsing plans. Suddenly, the sharp click of a door handle shatters the tense atmosphere. The heavy door creeps open, revealing a mysterious figure stepping into the room. A twisted realization dawns on the man's face as the tactical situation shifts. A malicious grin spreads across his face as he praises the absolute perfect timing of this encounter. Abandoning his slow torture method of plucking the bird's feathers, he decides he can no longer afford to patiently bide his time. With immediate lethal intent, he violently draws a razor-sharp dagger from its sheath. Vowing to execute Iswia's command without delay, the assassin turns his deadly blade directly toward the unsuspecting King Edel. Back at the palace, a heavily cloaked Edel prepares to depart into the pouring rain. Halting his decisive steps, the king glances back over his shoulder toward the doorway. Noticing her visible distress, he gently asks Widia what is troubling her. Clutching her hands anxiously, Widia gazes at him with deep, unspoken concern in her wide eyes. Softening his intense gaze, Edel reassures her that it is only a routine inspection and he will return safely by tomorrow. Continuing their intense conversation, King Edel resolutely assures the recovering girl that everything is finally all right. Curious about his sudden serious tone, Widia gently asks if his reassurance directly concerns the formidable Mrs. Barnet. Explaining his absolute royal authority, Edel firmly reveals he explicitly commanded the head maid never to be alone with Widia. Lowering his powerful voice, the king tenderly speaks Widia's name into the quiet space of his private royal chambers. Gazing deeply into her eyes, he delivers a steadfast vow to personally protect her from any lingering palace threats. Overwhelmed by his intense devotion, a stunned silence heavily settles between the two completely captivated individuals. Flustered by the overwhelming proximity, Widia frantically waves off his concern while Edel offers to swiftly assign a personal guard. Shattering the intimate moment, a royal attendant urgently announces from beyond the doorway that it is time for the king's departure. Reacting to the sudden interruption, Edel visibly tenses as royal duty forcefully pulls him away from the vulnerable girl. Resuming his regal demeanor, the monarch swiftly prepares to leave his chambers for the impending external inspection. Casting one final reassuring glance backward, Edel softly bids Widia a gentle farewell before stepping out into the hall. Raising her hand warmly, Widia cheerfully calls out a goodbye before suddenly pausing in mid-sentence as the door clicks shut. Left completely alone in the expansive room, a quiet atmosphere heavily descends upon the deeply contemplative girl. Lowering her gaze thoughtfully, she slowly begins to process the sudden rush of confusing emotions swirling violently inside her. Standing silently in the grand bedroom, she carefully untangles the profound emotional impact of the king's deeply protective words. The vast emptiness of the royal quarters heavily emphasizes her sudden solitude after Edel's incredibly abrupt departure. Clutching her dress tightly over her racing heart, a powerful wave of unfamiliar warmth violently washes over her fragile chest. Blushing deeply in the quiet isolation, she struggles to comprehend the intense fluttering intensely echoing within her soul. Sinking into deep introspection, her mind rapidly races to identify the true source of this overwhelming and unfamiliar affection. A startling realization slowly dawns on her fragile mind as she desperately tries to name this mysterious new feeling. Pondering her intense desire for his swift return, she nervously wonders if these intense feelings could actually be romantic love. Violently shaking her head, she frantically attempts to dismiss the dangerous romantic thoughts invading her highly vulnerable mind. Desperately rationalizing her attachment, she convinces herself that being with him simply makes her momentarily forget her crushing loneliness. Clinging desperately to that safe excuse, she softly reassures herself that her dependence is surely nothing more than a desire for company. Seeking a distraction from her violently racing heart, she tentatively begins to quietly walk through the empty royal corridors. Wandering aimlessly through the massive palace, the solitary girl carefully navigates the vast and highly intimidating stone hallways. Continuing her quiet stroll, the echoing silence of the massive castle heavily amplifies her deeply isolated state of mind. Approaching a darkened corner of the long corridor, a sudden terrifying shift in the atmosphere abruptly halts her gentle steps. Peering cautiously into the gloom, a chilling sense of dread violently spikes as she immediately notices a lurking presence. Heavy ominous footsteps rapidly echo from the dense shadows as a terrifying figure aggressively steps into the dim light. Startled by the sudden intrusion, Wedia visibly flinches in pure unadulterated shock at the highly unexpected nighttime confrontation. Emerging completely from the menacing darkness, the hostile assailant finally reveals their deeply furious and totally unhinged expression. Gasping in absolute horror, Wedia terrifyingly recognizes the intensely enraged face of the supposedly banished Mrs. Barnett. Trembling in pure physical fear, the confused girl desperately questions why the former headmaid is violently targeting her. Ignoring all logical reason, the unhinged woman aggressively lunges forward to brutally execute her deeply vindictive and lethal revenge. Stumbling backward in sheer overwhelming panic, Wedia lets out a terrified gasp as the lethal physical danger violently closes in. Frantically pleading for absolute mercy, the paralyzed girl helplessly begs the deranged woman to wait and explain her murderous actions. Completely overwhelmed by paralyzing fear, Wedia screams desperately into the empty halls for someone to save her from the assault. In a sudden explosive blur of motion, a powerful external force violently intervenes to physically halt the headmaid's lethal strike. Commanding the chaotic area with absolute authority, a rescuing guard forcefully subdues the shrieking attacker while ordering everyone to stand at ease. Mocking her timid companion, a palace maid boldly asks Yulia what she would have possibly done if left completely alone in the massive room. Heaving a deeply anxious sigh, Yulia nervously wonders aloud if the fragile queen is truly safe by herself in the royal quarters. Brushing off the mounting concern, the first maid confidently reassures her that the formidable Mrs. Barnett has remained permanently glued to the queen's side. Meanwhile, a deeply disgusted Mrs. Barnett arrogantly sneers at the rustic, unrefined food prepared in the lowly region of Ostrom. Looming menacingly in the oppressive darkness, the deranged headmaid viciously corners the completely isolated and defenseless queen. Striking with terrifying speed, the hostile woman violently seizes Wedia in a ruthless and overpowering physical grip. Desperately struggling against the sudden ambush, the panicked girl flails wildly as she tries to break free from her vicious attacker. Exerting her dominating physical strength, Barnett brutally hurls the fragile queen onto the hard, unforgiving stone floor. Glaring down with absolute malice, the unhinged maid ruthlessly orders the terrified woman to remain perfectly silent. Projecting cold, authoritarian dominance, Barnett forcefully commands her battered victim to immediately stand up on her trembling legs. Gasping in pure unadulterated horror, Wedia stares wide-eyed as the terrifying reality of her imminent execution finally sets in. Whispering with sadistic delight, Barnett chillingly declares that the long-awaited time for brutal revenge and severe punishment has finally arrived. Boiling with venomous jealousy, the crazed woman violently accuses Wedia of arrogantly enjoying the king's warmth and eating meals of her own free will. Clutching her rapidly heaving chest, the highly traumatized girl frantically gasps for air as overwhelming panic heavily suffocates her. Completely paralyzed by sheer terror, Widya desperately realizes her trembling body absolutely refuses to move or fight back against the threat. Unleashing her fully unhinged fury, Barnet mercilessly strikes the defenseless queen to aggressively assert her absolute lethal dominance. Groaning in immense physical agony, Widya helplessly endures the violent, unrelenting onslaught of the deeply deranged head maid. Grinning wickedly, Barnet sadistically taunts that the booming thunder and pouring rain will perfectly mask her victim's desperate, agonizing screams. Spitting pure vitriol, the madwoman viciously claims this brutal torture is entirely justified because Widya enjoyed being treated with such high importance lately. Lamenting her completely ruined plans, Barnet angrily complains that she has tragically run out of time to slowly and agonizingly torment her chosen target. Drawing a gleaming, razor-sharp weapon from her dark garments, the assassin rapidly prepares to deliver the final lethal blow. Staring down the terrifying blade, Widya visually paralyzes in absolute shock as the grim specter of death rapidly approaches her face. Trembling in absolute disbelief, the horrified queen finally processes that this supposedly trusted servant truly intends to murder her in cold blood. Summoning a fragmented shred of courage, Widya desperately warns her unhinged attacker that assassinating the reigning queen will never go unpunished. Unveiling her highly sinister trap, Barnet coldly presents a forged suicide note claiming the shameful, defiled queen tragically slit her own wrists. Widening her eyes in sheer terrified realization, Widya fully processes the incredibly devious and highly calculated framing maliciously plotted against her. Igniting a sudden spark of fiery defiance, the desperate girl furiously resolves that she absolutely cannot let this tragic, completely fabricated ending happen. Flooded with deeply protective thoughts of King Edel, she agonizingly wonders how utterly devastated he would be to brutally discover her fake suicide. Drawing upon profound newfound emotional strength, Widya passionately declares that she absolutely will not die and cause her beloved monarch any more sorrow. Channeling her fierce, undeniable will to survive, the resilient queen forcefully pushes back against the physically imposing and heavily armed homicidal madwoman. Utterly enraged by the highly unexpected physical resistance, Barnet aggressively snarls as her lethal, dominant grip momentarily falters. Shouting with absolute unyielding defiance, Widya furiously vows that she will never surrender her precious life to a treasonous murderer. Snapping into a fully murderous frenzy, Barnet violently lunges forward to savagely bury the highly lethal blade directly into her defiant victim. Desperately bracing her trembling arms, Widya frantically attempts to shield her highly fragile body from the imminent, fatal physical strike. A blood-curdling, utterly horrified scream violently tears through the oppressive darkness as the highly brutal midnight confrontation finally reaches its chaotic climax. The stormy, deeply chaotic night abruptly fades away, cleanly replaced by a stark transitional title sharply marking the arrival of the very next day. Sitting imposingly upon his grand, ornate throne, King Edel fiercely radiates an incredibly terrifying and completely murderous royal aura. Bowing highly respectfully, a fiercely loyal knight urgently reports the deeply horrifying details of Mrs. Barnet's late-night assassination attempt on Her Majesty the Queen. Explaining the highly suspicious aftermath, Vios professionally reports that the deeply deranged maid wildly claimed the brutal assassination was entirely her own personal will. Emitting an overwhelmingly cold and utterly terrifying presence, King Edel ominously commands his loyal guards to strictly keep the traitor alive until he personally executes his brutal interrogation. A tense and heavy silence hangs over the Grand Palace as urgent, invisible footsteps rapidly approach the royal chambers. Bursting violently through the heavy doors, the frantic king completely shatters the quiet, oppressive atmosphere. Rushing dangerously close to the bed, the highly panicked monarch desperately cries out Widya's name. Stepping forward with gentle but firm authority, an attending doctor urgently pleads for His Majesty to remain absolutely quiet. Staring in pure horror at her incredibly pale face, the terrified king frantically questions if she will survive this brutal ordeal. Answering with deep grim hesitation, the physician frankly states her survival depends entirely on her own fragile physical strength. He gravely explains that prolonged exposure to the freezing rain caused massive blood loss for her already weakened body. Gazing down at her highly unresponsive form, the devastated king softly whispers her assumed name in complete despair. Stepping smoothly out from the shadows, a loyal subordinate shockingly reveals that her true name is actually Edel. Standing at absolute rigid attention, Gario formally presents his highly anticipated intelligence report to the ruling monarch. He confirms returning from his vital investigation to officially declare she is merely the half-sister of the zealous princess born to a lowly maid. Processing this massive explosive revelation, Gario gravely concludes she was coldly sent as a completely disposable political substitute. He definitively reports that zealous Queen Iaswia is the true mastermind who maliciously orchestrated Mrs. Barnett's murderous actions. Commanding the heavy room with absolute regal authority, the king decisively orders everyone to leave them completely alone for a while. The heavy wooden doors forcefully click shut, leaving the solemn monarch totally isolated with his deeply injured bride. Taking a quiet seat beside the grand bed, he watches over her fragile and heavily bandaged body with intense devotion. Reaching out his trembling hand, he tenderly grasps her pale fingers while silently burying his face in overwhelming grief. Crushed by immense crushing guilt, the heartbroken king bitterly blames himself for totally failing to realize the brutal truth sooner. He agonizingly questions exactly how much tragic loneliness her highly slender and heavily battered body has silently endured all these years. A painful tragic realization intensely washes over him as he finally understands why her beautiful amethyst eyes were always filled with deep sorrow. Clutching her fragile hand incredibly tightly, he desperately begs his precious Edel to swiftly wake up from her terrifying slumber. Fiercely declaring his absolute, unyielding loyalty, he stubbornly vows that she is his beloved wife no matter what anyone else claims. A highly faint and deeply delicate murmur suddenly escapes the heavily unconscious girl's trembling lips. Shifting incredibly weakly against the heavy blankets, she lets out another soft groan as her hazy consciousness slowly surfaces. Startled by the sudden miraculous movement, the deeply anxious king abruptly jolts upright in sheer absolute shock. Leaning in with fierce urgency, he frantically asks the newly awakened Edel if she desires absolutely anything to eat. Slowly fluttering her heavily exhausted eyelids, the deeply disoriented girl groggily blinks against the bright ambient light of the grand chamber. Still trapped in a deeply hazy daze, she faintly whispers out a highly mysterious plea for someone named Yuan. Frozen in sheer absolute disbelief, the deeply stunned monarch silently processes the highly unfamiliar and totally unexpected name. Echoing the strange mysterious moniker, he softly repeats the name Yuan while a dark heavy shadow of confusion crosses his intense face. Bright morning sunlight suddenly floods the quiet royal room as the narrative cleanly transitions to a much later time. Smiling with immense glowing warmth, the cheerful maid Yulia happily informs her fully recovered queen that she may finally get out of bed. Expressing her immense overflowing gratitude, a highly relieved Edel sincerely thanks Miss Yulia for miraculously saving her fragile life. Beaming with pure unadulterated joy, the intensely loyal servant expresses her sheer unbridled happiness over Her Majesty's miraculous recovery. She playfully admits she deeply feared His Majesty would be the very next person to collapse from sheer absolute exhaustion. Dropping a deeply romantic massive revelation, Yulia gleefully explains that the devoted king constantly slept on the nearby sofa just to faithfully remain by her side. Flushing a remarkably deep crimson red, a highly astonished Edel completely short-circuits at the overwhelming absolute proof of his intense affection. Interrupting the highly tender joyful moment, the king forcefully clears his throat to dramatically announce his towering regal presence. Gasping in absolute total surprise, the flustered maid and her blushing queen instantly snap their undivided attention toward the imposing doorway. Dismissing the highly startled loyal servant, the king firmly commands Yulia to immediately leave him entirely alone with Edel. A quiet voice respectfully addresses His Majesty from the royal bed. The king gently commands her to stay in bed since she has not fully recovered. Sitting up slightly, the fragile girl looks at the imposing monarch with deep apprehension. A heavy and intense silence rapidly fills the grand royal chamber as the two lock eyes. Fidgeting nervously, she desperately struggles to find the proper words to speak. Lowering her head in deep shame, she formally offers him a highly sincere apology. She expresses profound regret for causing immense inconvenience to the king and the noble people of Ostrom. Confessing her heavily guarded secret, she shockingly reveals that she is not the true zealous princess. Proposing a swift annulment, she explains that keeping her prevents any friendly diplomatic relations with Zealous. The king calmly listens in complete silence to her utterly heartbreaking and desperate declaration. Gripping the soft bedsheets tightly, she mentally braces herself for his inevitable royal fury. To her absolute shock, the king gently places a deeply reassuring hand upon her head. Stunned by the highly tender physical gesture, the confused girl lets out a tiny bewildered gasp. He calmly validates her royal lineage by confirming she is indeed one of Zelus's white roses. Asserting his towering dominance, he reveals his master plan to force Zelus to recognize them as twin princesses while banishing Barnet. Declaring his absolute, unyielding resolve, he vows to never let the foreign kingdom refuse his fierce diplomatic demands. Testing her deeply fractured loyalties, he softly asks if she genuinely desires to return to her hostile homeland. Overwhelmed by intense lifelong insecurity, she tragically labels herself a completely worthless and disposable existence. Trembling in absolute fear, she hopelessly wonders if someone as utterly insignificant as her is even allowed to harbor personal desires. Fresh, agonizing tears rapidly well up in her beautiful amethyst eyes as she fiercely confronts her deep childhood trauma. Piercing directly through her emotional walls, the king astutely asks if her intense hesitation stems from a specific person's existence. Glancing upward in sheer sudden confusion, the highly disoriented girl wonders exactly what he means. A dark shadow of fierce jealousy crosses his royal face as he heavily questions her about the mysterious man named Yuan. Flushing deeply from the highly unexpected and intense interrogation, she completely freezes in absolute shock. Gathering her highly fragmented thoughts, she timidly begins to softly explain Sir Yuan's true identity. Fondly reminiscing, she explains that he acted like a protective older brother who secretly brought her sweets to stave off starvation. The king visibly relaxes his highly tense posture upon realizing the mysterious man was merely a platonic protector. A warm and deeply comforting silence gently settles over the highly intimate royal bedroom. Shedding heartbreaking tears, she confesses that Sir Yuan was the absolutely only person in that cruel castle who showed her pity. Murmuring her true name with overwhelming romantic affection, the devoted king gazes deeply at her fragile, recovering form. Offering profound emotional salvation, he firmly commands her never to resent her tragic birth since she did absolutely nothing wrong. Expressing his immense romantic gratitude, the monarch passionately declares he is deeply glad to be the king just because it led him to her. Leaning in incredibly close, the fiercely devoted king sincerely confesses his absolute and totally unwavering love for Edel. Uttering her highly precious name once again, he gently caresses her deeply tear-stained cheek. Surprising the heavily flustered girl, he suddenly announces his grand intention to bestow a brand new royal name upon her. He proudly bestows the highly majestic name Edelcia, declaring it absolutely perfectly suited for the grand kingdom of Ostrom. Banishing her dark traumatic past forever, he fiercely promises that she is officially reborn today as a truly invaluable person. Issuing an absolute and deeply romantic royal command, he fiercely orders Edelcia to remain by his side forever. Completely overwhelmed by his towering devotion, she gazes up at her powerful husband with deeply sparkling amethyst eyes. Fully embracing her radiant new life, the newly named queen tearfully and joyfully accepts his absolute royal command. Reflecting on her immense deep loneliness, she quietly admits she always wanted to be completely loved. Staring silently into the void, painful memories of her solitary past quietly resurface to haunt her. Gripping her chest fiercely, she firmly resolves to embrace this highly comforting newfound warmth. Barnet triumphantly assumes the commanding king has finally listened to her deeply twisted pleas. Demanding immediate release, the disgraced head maid furiously complains about her highly outrageous confinement. Glaring down with absolute disdain, King Edel coldly addresses the imprisoned and deeply deranged Mrs. Barnet. He sharply rebukes her sheer audacity for demanding freedom after attempting to brutally murder his queen. Trembling violently under his terrifying gaze, the unhinged woman completely freezes in sheer unadulterated horror. Breaking into a deeply unhinged cackle, the imprisoned head maid completely loses her fractured grip on reality. Spewing venomous hatred, she maniacally insults the reigning queen as a filthy slut's highly disposable daughter. Unfazed by her insults, the king sharply interrogates her regarding the current whereabouts of Edel's elusive mother. Briefly stunned by the sudden piercing question, the confused maid weakly repeats the completely unexpected inquiry. She callously admits the missing mother ran away right after the former queen of Xenos tragically passed away. Barnet carelessly speculates the sudden disappearance deeply relates to the bitter rivalry involving Queen Iaswia. Boiling with fierce resentment, she viciously blames Edel's mother for entirely ruining her prestigious court reputation. Grinning maliciously in the shadows, she wickedly concludes that Queen Iaswia is the true root of all evil. Furiously defending his beloved wife, The king severely promises absolute retribution for her highly treasonous crimes. Desperately clinging to her stolen authority, Barnet foolishly threatens him with Queen Iaswea's impending regal wrath. Silencing her immediately, Edel violently asserts his immense overarching urge to execute her right on the spot. Choking on her own paralyzing fear, the terrifyingly cornered woman lets out a highly pathetic breathless gasp. Stepping in gracefully, a loyal royal advisor respectfully tells His Majesty that the brutal interrogation is finally finished. The king coldly declares her final absolute fate completely depends on the impending diplomatic letter from Zealous. Realizing her absolute impending doom, Barnet violently shrieks her unhinged despair into the damp prison air. The dark oppressive atmosphere completely fades away as the story smoothly shifts to a much brighter palace moment. Sitting comfortably in a beautiful sunlit room, Edel peacefully enjoys a quiet and highly relaxing afternoon tea. She curiously inspects the deeply delicate and highly colorful pastries elegantly arranged on the table before her. Breaking the comfortable silence, the king softly calls her name with immense overwhelming warmth. He gently encourages her to taste the highly exotic luxury sweets exclusively procured from the distant south. Timidly picking up a beautiful pastry, she takes a highly delicate and incredibly hesitant bite of the sweet treat. Surprised by the absolutely delightful flavor, her sparkling amethyst eyes rapidly widen in pure astonishment. A bright and incredibly radiant smile rapidly spreads across her previously highly sorrowful and deeply traumatized face. Watching her joyful glowing reaction, the fiercely devoted monarch tenderly asks if she truly likes the delicious dessert. He affectionately muses that feeding his precious little fledgling bird has quickly become his favorite daily routine. Suddenly choking on a dry crumb, the highly flustered queen coughs while the king instantly worries for her safety. Frantically jumping into immediate action, he swiftly orders the palace servants to brew some fresh, soothing tea. Recovering her gentle breath, Edel warmly reflects that this peaceful existence is the absolutely sweetest time imaginable. Pondering palace dynamics, she quietly wonders why Lord Orcius has completely avoided seeking her royal company lately. Reassuring herself internally, she confidently asserts that she has fully recovered from her horrific violent ordeal. Snapping entirely out of her deep thoughts, a sudden powerful realization softly prompts her to address the king. Mustering her incredible newfound confidence, she boldly declares her absolute rightful presence as the ruling queen. Seeking validation, she hesitantly asks for confirmation from her towering husband. Desiring true royal duties, the young queen passionately declares she wants to work rather than just be pampered with sweets. Staring with fierce determination, she firmly stands her ground before the completely silent monarch. Pushing her request further, she eagerly asks to learn the native Ostromian language to better connect with her people. Bubbling with highly unexpected enthusiasm, she boldly requests to learn horseback riding and archery. Justifying her newfound martial ambition, she notes that all noble ladies in the kingdom are highly skilled in these arts. Taken completely off guard, the imposing king silently processes her highly unusual and dangerous requests. Skeptical of her sudden bravado, he bluntly asks if she has ever even physically touched a horse before. Gently shutting down her dangerous ideas, he logically advises her to pick a much safer indoor hobby instead. Attempting to redirect her energetic spirit, he thoughtfully suggests learning to play an elegant instrument like the lyre harp. Processing his much safer alternative, the highly fragile queen quietly considers the prospect of playing the harp. Noticing her deep hesitation, the fiercely devoted king gently questions if she dislikes his musical suggestion. Flustered but completely willing, she quickly agrees to try her absolute best at mastering the delicate new instrument. A peaceful and highly elegant transition highlights her dedicated shift toward mastering this refined indoor skill. Struggling with the delicate strings, she quietly admits the beautiful instrument is much harder to play than it looks. Carefully observing her powerful husband, she constantly tries to read his highly subtle emotional cues. The grand wooden doors swing open violently as the king abruptly prepares for his external royal departure. Commanding his loyal forces, the king fiercely orders the elite guards to protect his precious wife at all costs. Bowing deeply with absolute respect, the heavily armed royal guards immediately acknowledge his supreme command. Watching him leave the grand chamber, the young queen stands safely surrounded by her towering physical protectors. The narrative scene dramatically shifts to the dark, plodding corridors hidden deeply within the royal castle. Shadowy figures gather quietly in the gloom, whispering highly treasonous thoughts in the dimly lit stone halls. An ominous presence heavily looms as hidden enemies closely monitor the royal couple's highly intimate movements. Gripping a hidden lethal blade, a dangerous and highly motivated conspirator stews in deep political resentment. Observing from the shadows, a hidden enemy bitterly notes the king's highly unexpected romantic devotion to his new zealous bride. Scoffing in sheer disbelief, the conspirator curses the astonishing fact that the famously ruthless Black Wolf King has completely softened. Analyzing the dangerous political shift, they realize the royal bond has only grown significantly stronger since the failed assassination attempt. Fearing a permanently solidified bloodline, the traitor notes that any newborn child would immediately become absolute first in line for the throne. Boiling with intense political dread, the schemer coldly concludes that a royal heir would create an entirely irreparable situation for their faction. Targeting the highly fragile queen, the hidden enemy violently determines that she is completely in the way of their grand plans. Resolving to commit high treason, the desperate assassin coldly decides that Queen Edel absolutely must die to protect their political future.